Thank you, members. It's 10 o'clock. If we could start the meeting, please, and go to the first item on the agenda, which is election of chairman. Could I have nominations for chairman, please? Councillor Murphy?
Thank you. I'd like to nominate Philip White. It's quite clear guidance from the Welsh Government that the independent lay member should be chair of the committee. So I'm happy to propose Philip for that position.
Do I have a seconder? Yeah, okay. Any other nominations? No? Would you like to take a vote on Mr. White?
No, can I clarify that? I did not take advice from Welsh Government. There's a letter from Leighton Andrews that was sent to all authorities that made it quite clear what his preference was. And so my reference was to Leighton Andrews' letter.
Okay, we have a nomination and a seconder for Mr. White. Are there any other nominations before we take a vote on Mr. White? Okay, can I have a show of hands for Mr. White, please? That's carried. Thank you very much. Mr. White, would you take the chair, please?
While the chair's taking his place, can I apologise? I'm supposed to be in Swansea at the WLGA conference, so I'm sorry I'm going to have to go.
Right, good morning, everybody. Can I just say this is first meeting of a newly constituted Audit Committee. Many familiar faces out there, but welcome to any new members who've joined the committee. Before I say anything else, can we just check on who is here? I think we've got Val Smith at the back. You're observing, yes. Now we have a number of guests here today. Perhaps we could just run through who we have along the table down here.
Tony Price, Deputy Head of Chepstow School.
Of Chepstow School, yes, thank you.
Good morning, Craig Richmond, I'm Chairman of Governors of Chepstow School.
Right.
Chair, could people use their microphones?
Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to give people a reminder to use the microphones. If you're going to speak at all, just press the button on the microphone in front of you and make sure it's switched on. I understand the meeting is being live streamed. You can watch it on YouTube, I expect. And the way it works is that the cameras will land on you if you've pressed the button, and also will pick up what you say. If you don't press the button, it just goes silent as far as the live stream is concerned, which is interesting, but not ideal. And we also have here
hi, so I'm Laura Fallon. I work for Arling Close, so we're your Treasury Management Advisors.
Right, thank you very much.
Good morning.
Morning.
My name's Chris Taylor from Arling Close as well.
Thank you. Along the top of the table, I think we've mainly got Monmouth County Council officers, so you'll be introduced as we go along. Okay. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is the appointment of a Vice Chairman. Do we have any nominations, please? Yes, Councillor?
No, Chairman, I voted for that.
Councillor Strong, you've got a point.
Yes, I was just going to suggest that, or propose Councillor Higginson for Vice Chairman.
I'll second that, Chair.
Okay, well, that's clear enough. Any other nominations? Right, show of hands for Councillor Higginson, please. Thank you, that's passed. I'm sure he'll let us know if he has any difficulties with that. Thank you. Apologies for absence.
Just Councillor Murphy, Chair.
Yes, Councillor.
I have to leave about 11:15, Chair.
Chair, another point of order. You've just taken apologies from Councillor Murphy, yet you took vote off Councillor Murphy. I find that incorrect.
Apologies, Chair. I shouldn't have said apologies for Councillor Murphy. You are correct, yes.
Councillor Murphy was actually here at the meeting, so there's no apology needed. Okay. I've got the attendance sheet here, so I'm just going to start passing that around, just so we don't forget about it. Okay, well, the next item on the agenda is the public open forum. If there were members of the public present, this is the point at which I would invite them to make any questions that they wanted to ask, but we don't have any members of the public present apart from those people who are on the agenda, so I'll pass over that. I'll just say at this point that I'm going to take item 10 immediately after the item 7, which is the action list from the last committee meeting. I'm doing this because I've been requested to do it because of a timetabling issue. And if there are no objections to that, that's what I'm going to do. Okay, declarations of interest. This is largely done as we go through the items. If people want to make a declaration then. Did you have a point to make?
I was only going to declare an interest because I'm a governor of Chepstow School.
Fine, thank you very much. Right, let's have a look at the minutes of the Audit Committee, which was held on the 16th of April. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but are there any points anyone wants to make about the accuracy of those minutes? Right, can I therefore suggest that we've accepted those minutes as an accurate record of the previous meeting? Councillor Edwards. Thank you very much. That's passed then. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the action list. Okay, well, the first item on the action list was for Mr. Davis to provide a written summary of the information that he provided to the committee on the 5th of March 2015. I noted that he did that on the 28th of April. He did say, I believe, that further information on vacant posts was to follow. I've been recently told that he hasn't been able to produce this as quickly as he hoped, but it's still there waiting for that.
Chair, if I can, weren't we promised 6 weeks for that? Wasn't there a time limit put on it?
I think he thought that he would be making progress within a fairly short time, but I think there've been difficulties arisen on his side that's prevented him from providing the extra information at this time. Mr. Davis isn't here to confirm, but that was the information I was given a couple of days ago. Right, well, the item for Mr. Cope we're taking as an agenda item. The formal report on complaints from Mrs. Evans, that was supplied on the 6th of May. I thought that was a good and comprehensive report. We've got representatives from Chepstow School here today, so we'll be listening to them. The next item is similar to what I just said about vacant posts, that I've been told that the information is still on its way, but he hasn't been able to collate it just yet. And the next three items, all down to Mr. Wyndham and the Welsh Audit Office, that information was provided to us on the 28th of April. So unless there are any further comments on that, I'll now move on.
Chair, I would like to make a comment on the fact that we met 2 months ago and we've had reasons for 2 reports not coming back to us. I think that the committee ought to be given more credence when they ask these questions, that they come to the next committee. You mentioned 2 from Mr. Davis. I'd just like to register my point that I think they should be given more importance.
we'll make sure that's minuted. As I said, the explanation I was given was that he wasn't able to make as much progress as he'd hoped. It's to do with, I think it's a lot to do with the end of the financial year and the amount of work that he had to do, but I think there are probably systems issues as well. So we're now going to move on to item 10, which is a report from the Passenger Transport Unit Manager regarding purchasing used vehicles. Just to supply a little bit of context, last time Mr. Cope gave us a presentation, he was asked whether he could give us a case study of a procurement exercise so that we could see how it was done. Now, you've provided us with a written paper. Do you wish to introduce that paper?
Thank you, Chair. Basically, I've gone through the report to evidence the purchasing of the last vehicle that we purchased, which was about August last year. And obviously, within the report, it details exactly the steps that we take to begin the process. Currently, we have had quite a number of discussions with procurement and our own procurement and other procurement officers within other authorities as well, looking for ways in which second-hand purchase can be made. Basically, with Sell to Wales, it doesn't give you any sort of scope for second-hand vehicle purchases, and also there are no frameworks currently in operation for second-hand purchase anywhere within the country. We have tried to look for them, but there aren't any. We've even gone to the National Procurement Service, and I had a meeting with those last week actually regarding something else, but they said there is nothing for second-hand purchases. And by putting it on Sell to Wales, you probably would restrict the market even further, because people who are selling second-hand vehicles, they want to sell them as quick as they possibly can. And yes, they may register an interest, but they may not. And we went out to probably more companies to be able to quote for a vehicle than probably we would have got from Sell to Wales. The way in which we did it, in consultation with the Chief Auditor and our audit team, is that we went out to a list of companies which I've listed on the report, which I think was 28 different companies that sell second-hand vehicles in Great Britain, and we had replies back off 5 of those. With vehicles to look at. We viewed vehicles at 4 of them. The one from base did not come up to the specification, and obviously we write out a specification of what we require in the first instance. We then looked at these vehicles, and I've detailed within that report exactly what those vehicles were and how we looked at them and what, why the vehicle that we chose was chosen. So I don't know if any member has any questions they'd like to ask.
Perhaps you could just tell us what Sell to Wales is. I'm not sure everyone knows about that.
Yeah, Sell to Wales is a Welsh Government sort of website where most tenders are advertised. So if you have advertise a tender for a new vehicle or for construction equipment or anything like that, it's normally put on Sell to Wales. And within our sort of school transport procurement, we use e-Tender Bravo, which is the Welsh Government's e-tender in Wales service. And obviously, we'd like to be able to do that for some of the vehicles as well. So we are looking into how we do this. And I'm also looking at something called a dynamic purchasing system. With the framework agreements, you have a problem because once they're set, say for 4 years, nobody else can join them. So if another company came into the fold within the next 3 or 4 years, selling vehicles, or a new manufacturer came in, they wouldn't be able to join that framework until it came out again for retendering. With dynamic purchasing, there is a facility that they can join it during the period of the tender.
Thank you. I'll throw it open to questions from the committee then. Councillor Easton.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, Richard. You take on looking at these vehicles. What sort of mileage would you expect a reasonable vehicle to be in when you take it on? Because as a coach, whatever, they would trot around a fair few miles. And having that level of mileage recorded, what sort of mileage would you expect it to become before the vehicle becomes the need of another engine, maybe? And what does LES mean? And you've got some specifications in there, which CD radio, toilet, etc. I presume that they're generally standard fittings in a modern coach.
Yes, thank you, Councillor. Mileage-wise, obviously a coach will do a lot of miles before you have to put a new engine in it. But it depends on how it's been looked after in many ways. Some coaches on the road are perhaps 20, 25 years old, and they probably still got the same engine from day one if they've been looked after properly. When you're looking for a new vehicle, obviously, within this detailed specification I've given here, the mileage is on 3 of those coaches, as you can see, was over 1 million kilometres. They were being used on National Express, very, very hard work, back and forth down the motorways, and they were showing, great signs of wear, basically. Mileage-wise, anything up to sort of 500 Ks shouldn't be an issue at all. And obviously those vehicles would go on to do well over 1 million Ks. I can remember when I was in the private industry that we had a minibus that did over 1 million miles on the same engine, because it was looked after. And that's what it's all about, really. If you do regular oil changes, some companies don't change their oil for perhaps 2 or 3 years, but you do 6 monthly oil changes, it makes a big difference to an engine. LEZ is London Low Emission Zone. So if we send a vehicle to London on a trip, it has to be LEZ compliant. So basically it's to do with emissions. So when it goes into London, it doesn't throw out too many emissions. And if you don't have the LEZ compliance certificate for that vehicle, then you get fined. And that fine can be anything between £500 and £2,000. So obviously you have to have that, otherwise it's not worth sending the vehicle to London. CDs, yes, obviously that's probably a basic specification. Toilet on some of these vehicles is for school trips, basically, because they like to have a toilet on the vehicle for any emergencies or anything else. But you wouldn't get a toilet on a 70-seater, which is a standard school bus. There's not enough room within the chassis to put a toilet in those.
Can I come back on the mileage issue? I understand the point that some vehicles will go many, many miles. If it's done 500k, a good vehicle on the motorway may not get the same sort of bashing as you would get on the country roads. How do you assess, or can you assess, 2 vehicles that have done 500k as to the value of one against the other? Yes, you could buy one with 500k and it may last another 300k, and then you've got to have another engine.
In assessing them, obviously we put them over the pit, look at the engines, etc., and everything else, all the other mechanical sides of these vehicles. But to take them on a road test tells you a lot. You can tell when you're driving the vehicle virtually whether or not that engine is still pretty good. You can tell by the way the vehicle pulls. I mean, we went to look at one of those vehicles in there, I think it was with Plaxton's, and it had a smaller engine in it. And then you take it up a hill, which is close to where the used vehicle company is, and you can tell exactly whether that vehicle is going to be any use to you, really, because it will pull differently to another vehicle. You can actually tell by driving it that vehicle should be good. I mean, any vehicle, you can bring a new vehicle out of the showroom tomorrow, and within a week something can happen, and the engine could go in a new vehicle. You just don't know that for certain, but you have to just basically take a view of exactly how the vehicle drives more than anything else.
So you're comfortable with getting value for money as best as you can tell?
Yes, obviously when we're looking at them, we test them out, we try them out. Most of the vehicles we've had have been fairly good. As they come towards the end of the leasing periods, obviously they start to cost more maintenance as they get older, but basically I think value for money wise, then I think we've done pretty well out of them, really.
Right, thanks very much for that. Councillor Jordan.
Morning, Richard. Two questions, really. First is to do with volume. In any period, what number of vehicles are we talking about, say, within 18 months, a 2-year period? And the second question is, how do we then dispose of the vehicles once you've decided that they've passed their sell-by date?
It depends on when we took the leases out, really, on how many vehicles per annum we do. I mean, last year we had 5 to change. This year I think we've got perhaps 4 or 5 again to change because the leases are coming out. Certain vehicles, like we bought Alexanders from new back in 2006, they don't manufacture those vehicles any longer, so they're low floor. So we'd look to keep those vehicles for a further period or buy them out of the lease. So if we bought them out of the lease, then obviously they would become our property and the leasing costs would then cease on them. But normally we keep them over a period of 6 years. We wouldn't keep them any longer than 6 years unless they're a specialist vehicle like the Alexanders. There are different ways of purchasing them now than what we did when we were back in 2006 and 2008 when we bought them. We bought them all those on lease, and when they go back off lease, then you have to take them back. The leasing company comes out and does an analysis of them, and then anything that needs to be done, you do it, and they go back off lease. So you've just finished with them then, and then you take out a new lease or you buy a new one. But the way in which we do it now, I think, is that it's done a lot more through prudential borrowing because the rate is a lot less, and we can then buy them over a period of 6 years. And then obviously there's a residual value at the end of that. So you're actually paying for, if you buy a vehicle, say, for 100,000, and then in 6 years' time it's worth 50,000, you're only paying the 50,000 leasing costs over that period. And then when we sell it off, we get the residual value back.
Wanted to ask a question?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thanks to Richard for the paper. I certainly agree that we in internal audit and colleagues in procurement have worked with Richard to try and evolve the process over a period of time. And generally, we are a lot more comfortable with it now than perhaps we were sort of 3 or 4 years ago. Just one question I did have. We have spoken, Richard, in the past about using Sell to Wales, but also possibly writing to your company contacts as well, just to advise them that the notification is going on Sell to Wales. From our point of view, possible advantage of that was if there were other companies in the marketplace that you weren't writing to, they could still have the opportunity to perhaps pick up that you were looking to make a purchase. I just wondered if there was any progress on that.
Yes, thanks. I have spoken with procurement, our procurement office, and yes, we can possibly do that. And I don't think there's any reason why we can't do that when we look out for new vehicles. I'm also looking at frameworks and also looking at dynamic purchasing at the moment to see if we can actually put it onto one system where it all goes through the same flow, basically. But if we can't, then yes, I think Sell to Wales we could do and send it out to all the companies as well.
Councillor Jordan.
Sorry, it's me again. If we are using the cheaper option of prudential borrowing as opposed to leasing, why are we buying second-hand vehicles and not new vehicles? And if we're buying 6 vehicles on average per annum, wouldn't we get a bulk deal directly from a manufacturer?
Yeah, the problem we have with new vehicles, as I did explain at the last meeting, was that sometimes you can't get like 70-seater vehicles that are fit for what we require them for. Most of the 70-seater vehicles that we purchase now at the current time are probably conversions, because the ones that are being manufactured have no luggage space, they have no sort of room in them, they're very, very tight on the chassis, and they're not really fit for the type of work that we do. I agree, yes. New purchases, I think, obviously moving forward, we look at new purchases as well and see which is the best value that we can attain. For certain types of vehicles and certain sizes of vehicles, that might be the road to go down. Again, though, with new vehicles, we've looked at framework agreements for new vehicles, and they're very restrictive in the number of companies that are on them. I had the one from the Crown Procurement Service through our procurement team a couple of weeks ago, and there are only 4 manufacturers on there. And all those 4 are like Volvo, Mercedes, Plaxton, and King Long, I think, which is a Chinese company. So you're actually restrictive on where you can go with that one. And there is another one around that has 5 on it, but they don't have all the companies on there. So it's a case of looking for what is best fit for what you require, really. Obviously, with the type of work that we do, we have different trips that go away. If you take school children away on a trip to Talibont, for instance, to go for a week, you have to have luggage space because they're going to have quite a substantial amount of luggage for that trip. So if you buy, say, a new 70-seater, they wouldn't have luggage space on a lot of them. I think detailed in this specification here was one of a fast bus, which was a 70-seater, which was unregistered, but it had no luggage space virtually. You know, you get 1 or 2 cases on it, and that would be it. So it wouldn't be any good for the type of work that we do.
Okay, Councillor Dovey, is it? Yes, that's fine.
2 points, Richard. Do we identify current coach users, good quality companies? And is there any way that we could seek to make an arrangement with them that they post with us if they're the sort of vehicle that we would like to use, the quality maintained, etc. Is there any way that we can reach some sort of agreement with a current user that we have opportunity, first opportunity on any of the vehicles that can come up? And the second thing, with the point that you made about the buses and not having the luggage space on them to be able to use, I note with a lot of the Continental buses that they actually have trailers on the back of them for luggage, so that they can be used for one purpose, if you like, where you don't need the luggage for a lot of work is done, but you can put a trailer on the back if you need to change it for the job. Those are the only 2 points I wanted to raise.
Thank you, Councillor. With regards to making an arrangement with another company, I don't think procurement would be very happy in us doing that, because we would then be virtually restricting the market, and I don't think that would go down very well with audit or with the actual procurement side. And also, with regards to a trailer, I understand where you're coming from, but unfortunately, not every driver has a trailer license. Not all PCV drivers would have that unless they've taken the relevant tests. So we would be restricted with the number of drivers that we could put on the vehicle.
Yeah, the proper business of audit, of course, is the financial arrangements of the council, rather than whether they have a trailer on the buses or not. But members are quite free to ask whatever questions they want. Make that clear. I just had one point I wanted to make. The final decision on this case study was decided by you and your deputy. Is that right? Did you, or do you consider there is a need to have an independent assessor making that final decision, for example, from finance?
I got no objection to anybody else making or helping to make a decision. The only thing I would say is that if you're making a decision on your own sort of business, you would know what your business is. If somebody from finance was to make a decision and they said, oh yes, well, this is the best one, it may not be the best fit for our business. And with the license being in my name as the actual transport manager, if we had something or brought a vehicle to the license that wasn't fit for purpose, my good repute could be brought into question. But as I said, I have no problems with finance actually, being involved with it, or anybody else as it comes to that, as long as there's, an objective discussion when looking at it. Because obviously, the type of business that we have, we know what we run during the day, and if the vehicles purchased are the wrong vehicles, then it's not going to be fit for purpose for us.
I feel that the independent input would be about the process rather than about, the decision about the vehicle itself. I don't know whether internal audit have anything to add on that.
Yes, thank you, Chair. In a way, that's already picked up through the exemption process for the higher value purchases. In any case, that the senior officers have to sign off on these purchases because they are out with the scope of our contract procedure rules. So there is a bit of independent review at that stage there that would satisfy that.
Thank you very much. Well, if there's no more points to raise to Mr. Cope, I know he wants to get away. He's got to go to another meeting. But I'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Cope, for answering the committee's questions and providing the case study as requested. Thank you. Right then, well, the next item on the agenda is that we have invited the head teacher and governors from Chepstow School to discuss the issues that were raised at a previous audit committee meeting. I did write to Chepstow School setting out the issues that were identified, which I think the committees are all aware of. So what I'm going to suggest we do is that I'm going to give the representatives of Chepstow School an opportunity to address the meeting however you want, and then I'll just throw it open to questions and discussion. Okay.
Thank you very much for inviting us to be able to come and discuss with you both the challenges and successes of our school. And I think the first thing I'd like to talk to you about is the context of our school. You'll be aware that I took over as head teacher at Chepstow in January 2012. Before that, I'd been involved in a turnaround academy in England, where we'd moved from being a failing school to an outstanding school. And that was one of the reasons for my appointment at Chepstow. Undoubtedly, Chepstow School in January 2012 was a failing school, and it was a failing school on a number of different levels. Our school roll was on a devastating downward trajectory. We had a planned admission number of 191, and in January 2012, when I started at the school, 118 students had opted to come to our school. Student outcomes were significantly below where they should be. We were in the bottom quarter of all schools, so the bottom 25% of all schools in Wales for our achievement, despite the fact that students came to us from Key Stage 2 from our primary schools within quarter 1 and quarter 2, so the top 25% of all schools. We were failing to provide a satisfactory education, and each year around half of our students left without 5 good GCSEs, including English and maths. So on any level, academically and educationally, we were a failing school. Of course, to be an educationally failing school, it means that there are probably other things that are failing, and certainly in January 2012, a number of other things were failing. We were a school with no real systems in place. We had no legally compliant systems in place. We had things like no self-evaluation, no school improvement planning processes. We didn't have a full CRB check, so we didn't know that actually the adults in the school were able and eligible to work within the school. We had no staff performance systems in place. We had no staffing mechanisms. And there was what can best be described and has been described to me at the time as a toxic culture within the school. And underpinning all of that, it did mean that financial management was also poor. There was no strategic planning. There was no real system of financial control. And there is evidence of financial mismanagement, which no doubt I'll talk to you about as we come across. So I was in January 2012 facing some fairly significant dilemmas about what to do first. And I took with the support of the Chair of Governors, sort of 3 decisions about priorities. Number 1, making sure we were legally compliant, making sure that every adult who was in the school had the clearance to be in the school, making sure that we had all the necessary health and safety legalities covered, which we didn't at the time, and that we had key school systems in place. Secondly, we were facing a budget deficit that year. So in January, I was told that we were facing around an £80,000 budget deficit, which was looking at being a £1.1 million deficit within the 3 rolling years. And I made some staffing decisions, some of which you may well be reading about in the papers now, about actually reviewing staffing and about making sure that we had the right number of staff at the right salary grade. It's important, I think, that I probably tell you at the time in January when I came, nearly every member of staff had a teaching and learning responsibility. So we're being paid up to £9,000 a year more than doing a classroom teacher's job, but we're doing a classroom teacher's job. So that was the second priority. And then thirdly, and the reason that I believe is the purpose of being a head teacher, the priority was for me about improving student outcomes, so making sure that we stopped failing young people in our school and made sure that students had a positive experience and made sure that they left equipped to be the sort of citizens that in Monmouthshire we would like them to be. And in terms of student results, undoubtedly, I think we've been undeniably successful. Over the past 4 years, we've increased our results by nearly 20%, 19.6% of results. We've moved from the bottom 25% of schools to the top 25% of all schools. And we're moved from a position of failure where Estin came and were very derogatory about us to school categorisation, which has put us in yellow as good. Which is a fantastic achievement within a short space of time. English results have risen from the bottom quarter to the top quarter. Maths results have done a similar thing, and they're now at around 78% for last year, and we're projecting over 80% of all students leaving our school with a GCSE in Maths and English. And the impact of this is obviously also felt in the community. So instead of 118 students who wanted to join us in January 2012, 183 students want to join us in September. So in terms of that moral purpose and about prioritising where we were, I think that we've done the right thing by young people in our school. However, obviously focusing on what was a difficult culture, about adults rather than about children, and about low levels of aspiration and expectation, did mean that the financial systems, where they were not pressing, perhaps didn't receive the same attention. In August of 2012, after I'd uncovered a series of what I felt to be fairly serious issues or very serious issues around financial mismanagement, the bursar decided to leave our school. And the Chair of Governors and I were left with some important decisions to make around that. We were looking at being in a financial position that was shaky, even though we had reversed the budget deficit. We'd made an in-year saving of £80,000 and moved from looking at a deficit to being in a break-even. We knew, given the fact that our school roll was declining, that the little things were going to tip us off balance financially. And we decided that given the bursar leaving, to invest our money into raising standards rather than reappointing a school bursar, and we're still in that position now. Since 2012, all of our decisions have been predicated on exactly that same focus, on young people, on their making sure that they have the best education they possibly can. And we have been singularly successful at that. Some costs to the school have undoubtedly increased because of that focus, and I still think that was the right decision to make. We have built up during the time since 2012. I think we were a fairly isolated school in January 2012, where I don't think there were effective partnerships with the local authority or with our cluster of schools or with other schools more widely. Since 2012, we have built up a number of very supportive working practices. We've been incredibly grateful for the support from Nikki Wellington and her team, the financial team, in making sure that we're always as legally compliant and financially going in the right direction. We've been very grateful for the work that Mark Howcroft has recently done with us as well, with us and the governing body, and I look forward to that being a relationship that we continue. And we've also been, over the last 3 years, working very, very closely with our cluster of primary schools, and some of the things we're looking at jointly, and in today's financial climate this will happen more and more, but some joint financial arrangements around back office functions. which we're moving towards. As the standards and the improved culture have become embedded, which they certainly have, we're now able to pay specific attention to financial systems. We have agreed a recovery plan with the local authority. I mean, we have had incarnations of a recovery plan, and we were really grateful for Mark for stress testing with us our recovery plan to make sure that that was robust. And that's now owned by the governing body. It's a real roadmap for us to follow to make sure that we know every step of the way where we are financially. And it also gives us a space to reflect on systems and the underpinning things moving forward. I think it's also for me to reiterate really that even though some of the financial issues that we're going to discuss now have certainly been inherited by the school, I completely own them and have worked very hard to move them forward and to resolve them. And where previous academy experiences and financial regs that might look differently from previous experiences have led to me having different expectations, I've admitted those and made those look differently as well. I've also worked very closely with the audit team to resolve our audit report, some of which is still issued to us in draft, some of which we felt to be not reflective of where we were, and some of them I know that we've been looking at moving forward. And our whole imperative is to make sure that the school operates not just as an excellent educational system, but also operates sort of with excellent financial systems as well. I'm happy to go through point by point now, if you would like that, the specific points raised in your letter to me, if you'd like me to do that. The first issue that you raised was about the issuing really of it says a high value contract. It was a Danwood photocopying contract. And the issues raised by the audit and are then questioned by you are around whether the appropriate paperwork was retained, whether we were paying more than we should do, and whether the school had acted well enough to be able to resolve that situation in a quick enough time. And I'm going to sort of take you through a little journey of some of the reasons that we were in this position and some of the things we've done as a result of it. And we uncovered the Danwood photocopying contract when we were looking at very tight financial controls that we wanted to implement. And one of the first things, because you're right, you look at the photocopying contract, and we went on right, we'll make sure that we minimise all of our printing costs, at which point we uncovered the fact that we were in a evergreen contract that was fixed by the previous bursar for 5 years, and in fact we were in a worse position than that when we investigated it. There was no, from what we've been able to see, there's certainly been no paperwork retained from the contract that was signed in 2009. And it was signed without the knowledge of the governing body. It hasn't been to the finance governors either at that point. So we worked our way backwards to see how we became to be in that position. In an audit report of 2007 and 8, exactly the same point was raised about tendering processes for contracts of a value. And that, at that point, related to a contract that had been put in place with Algebra for an IT contract. And Algebra were then taken over by Danwood. And so it was the similar company, or the same company, that we were dealing with. We couldn't find evidence of contracting. Every other tendering, every other contract that we'd let at that time had the full paperwork. And so we were left in a position with a contract that we didn't know where it had come from and where it was. We then found out that the Evergreen contract had a technology refresh period in it, which meant that actually what we'd believed to be a 5-year contract didn't start until the technology refresh period was terminated, which hadn't been terminated. And in fact, the value of the contract had been increased without anybody's knowledge just before I took over the post. I suppose one of our concerns that comes back is this has been in place for a long period of time in several audits. It was raised by the school in 2013. When we uncovered this, we started to look at where it was. We sought legal advice from the local authority that was unable to resolve the situation. We told finance and the audit audit team when they came around that we felt we had an unsafe contract in some respect. Through the local authority legal services, we've been unable to resolve the contract. Tony and I have, a deputy, have negotiated an early end date to the contract compared to where we are. We haven't yet signed and fully agreed that end date because it's now in the hands of an independent legal firm looking to see whether there's an out clause for it. So I just wanted to sort of reiterate to you that actually it wasn't that we had a contract that we'd inherited or that we'd in fact put in place. Sorry for this, my letter's on my phone. That we'd put in place since then. Actually, we were trying to resolve that situation, and we've taken every step that we can. It is slow to resolve the situation, and we're still not in the place we would like to be. But that is that. Yes, I'd agree with your next point about preliminary comparisons with other secondary schools. Absolutely, we're paying more than we should be. But I would like to say that we have taken every step that we can within our powers to try and resolve it, and those steps are still ongoing. The next point you've asked us about the audit raise was that there was no full documentation of a catering contract. We were surprised by this because actually we had run the catering contract tendering through Litmus. We'd run it in conjunction with the other secondary schools. We had all the paperwork in place, and it's still available now. I think it's also important for you to know that whereas in 2 other secondary schools that contract has been terminated more quickly with the catering contract that it was let with, ours is still going very well. We have a 4-star hygiene rating, and all the concerns that were raised elsewhere have not been raised by us. So in terms of that contract, that's always been in place, that was always run well, and it was run in tandem with the other schools as well. The next set of issues really you raised were around segregation of duties. So there was no review of income returns by a person independent of the banking routines, and there was insufficient segregation of duties in the ordering and receipting process. In January 2012, there are only 2 people in the financial process, the bursar and the finance officer. And we didn't necessarily have a very robust system. One of the things that we had got in place was the training of additional staff in order to be part of that financial process. We trained 1 member of staff who shortly afterwards had a long-term sickness that was related to a pre-existing DDA condition, which meant that we were back to where we'd started. And also we had other staff trained to do other duties that we'd had to wait a significant amount of time for them to be able to gain access to Aggresso. We were left in a difficult position. We'd identified it, we'd put the training in place, and what we have done since is train more people to make sure that the systems are in place, that we're never again in a place where 2 people are relied on in order for that system to work. So we have got proper segregated systems and duties in place. Budget overspend is the next one, and I've probably talked quite a lot about how that happened. We had a plan, we had a deficit that was coming. We had sorted out the deficit in January 2012. We knew we were on shaky ground. We had put in increasing systems to review staffing. We had a greater focus on student outcomes. We made sure that all staff understood what they were responsible for in terms of their roles and responsibilities, which hadn't been the case before. We have a contractual obligation for teaching staff, for example, to be on duty for 1,265 hours of a year, and we were expecting staff to be delivering about 2/3 of that amount of hours, so that's changed, so we got value for money. We've put in financial controls to reduce spending. We centralised any ordering on capitation so that it was centralised in a place so we could stop ordering if we needed to. And we put in all the controls and reserves we could, bearing in mind we were also raising standards. We also knew that we were in a shaky position. We were running a zero budget, if you like, in a situation of dramatically falling roles, and we knew that anything anything might be able to derail us, and we were trying as hard as we could to stop that happening. In 2012-13, I did look at staff performance, and a number of staff's performance was questioned. There were a number of staff whose performance was supported in order to improve. And there were also a number of people who took redundancy or who left rather than work under the school teachers' paying conditions. We had 3 long-term sicknesses that were associated with the beginnings of a capability system, and one of these, if I give you a bit of a context there, we had an ESTIN themed inspector, and the ESTIN inspector, the lead inspector, came to me to tell me that he'd observed a lesson that was unsafe, i.e. he felt that the lesson should be stopped, because what was going on in terms of behaviour and safety of children wasn't satisfactory. We also had at the same time, which no one could have envisaged, which was our sort of rocket, I suppose, that was our risk, was we had 2 members of staff who were diagnosed with cancer who were off for a lengthy period of time, and one in fact died. So that led to us having to prioritise where we spent our money and what we did. And there we prioritised absolutely making sure that kids got the best outcomes they did. So we had an increased supply cost or staffing costs in order to make sure that children made the best progress they could. We also had other financial costs that were accrued to the school. A lot of them came from what I believe was financial mismanagement in the past. There was an overestimation of income, significant. We had money that was put against Welsh Government grants that weren't actually compliant with that grant, that were clawed back in the following financial year. And we also had accruals from the building services for past work sort of being charged to us two years later. And we were in a position really where staff costs were bigger because we were trying to build capacity in our staff that were unused to having their performance managed, unused to focusing on children, and unused to actually having to meet the needs of our vulnerable students who in the past had perhaps been passed out of the school. What we've done since then is we have a budget recovery plan, which, as I said before, been really grateful to work in partnership with both Nikki and with Mark and Nikki's team in order to make sure that it's robust, and it absolutely is pinned down that we are projecting worst case scenarios. We have a monthly check of spending against where we should be. And this robust plan is owned by the governors, who do check it on a monthly basis, and that is set to secure our long-term financial future. You raised a question about interest-free loan to a member of staff who'd moved to the area to take up a teaching post of the school. During the school year 2012-13, we had a long-standing member of staff who had very poor attendance. Her attendance was around about 70%, and it was not big chunks of time. It was one of those situations where people take the time that they can. And student performance in her subjects, and there were 2 key A-level subjects, were appalling. So they were in A-level terms. You get put into 6th, and they were in the bottom of the bottom 6th. She applied for the ability to leave the school, which we were happy to grant. And we had to look for a teacher then in what was a very shortage subject that is very difficult to get, mostly because teacher training courses are very difficult. There's one teacher training course in social science across the UK, so we knew to get a very good teacher was going to be hard. We did appoint a fantastic member of staff who at interview raised the point that actually she was going to find it difficult to take up the post if there weren't the ability to provide relocation. In conjunction with HR advisor from Monmouthshire County Council, looking at the recruitment policy, we were told we were able to give a loan with the permission of the Chair of Governors, which was granted, for a loan to be able to cover the removal costs. what we know we didn't do, which was perhaps a point that the audit were making for us, was we didn't set up a sufficiently timely repayment of that loan. What we have done now is to set up a repayment that is in fact finishing, I think it's next month, and going forward we've built into our recruitment policies that should we be doing that again, then we'll make sure that any loan is repaid within 12 months. Audit raised the point of whether there were tax liabilities for the loan, and we've investigated that fully, and there are no tax liabilities for the loan. You also raised a point about starter leaver and amendment forms not being countersigned by a senior manager. What we were doing was countersigning the batch run of HR forms, which was a system in place before. What we have now instituted is with every single form that goes through, it's countersigned before the form goes through, which I think makes us compliant to that part. The point of an inventory was raised, that we had no comprehensive inventory in place, which was true, and we knew we had it on our list to do, and that was one of the things that perhaps we hadn't made sufficient time for when we were focusing on the other things. We've introduced a new electronic barcoding system that's in place now, and we've completed an inventory plan for the whole school. We're waiting to do furniture over £100 during the summer holidays in order to make sure that all of our goods within the school are now fully inventoried. In terms of the minibus, issues were raised about documentation about vehicle faults not being remedied. That was actually put in place straight after the audit was raised, and we made sure that was all there and in place. But in fact, we at the moment don't have a school minibus, so in terms of that being an issue, that's there. There were errors identified in travel and subsistence claims, and there was issues raised about 2 staff members eligible for relocation mileage have been potentially significantly underpaid. In terms of the travel claim forms, what we have done is made sure that we had redesigned the travel claim forms, but we've now, with the advice from audit, made sure that we've completely redesigned them again so that the errors that were pointed out are impossible to replicate. In terms of the relocation agreement, predating me by about 18 months, I think, or a year, special class unit was moved from Monmouth Comprehensive following a flood to our school, and the relocation agreements were all brokered with Monmouthshire County Council. We had no paperwork, and actually we couldn't trace down the paperwork within the local authority either. Any issues around that have certainly been resolved and made sure that they've been paid in the right way, but actually, again, as an issue, I hold my hands up that I didn't go and check that we had all the paperwork in place, and it wasn't a priority for us, and maybe it should have been. However, we certainly have any system that if there was to be a relocation, we would make sure that that paper trail was all in place. We had in fact paid the correct mileage to these people according to the local authority agreement that had been made, and there wasn't a significant underpayment as far as we're aware. The last thing was about the school private fund, that there was no secondary check of the school private fund bank allocation, and that the income wasn't banked intact. And also about alcoholic beverages. The alcoholic beverages, I'll hold my hand up to, and we certainly don't do that anymore. In terms of the, where are you showing it to me, Tony?
Segregation of duties.
It's about the banking impact. I know we have a system for our private fund bank reconciliation going forward, and ever since we've made sure that within time we have made sure that reconciliation counts, and that we have an audit of it each at the end of each academic year at the right point In terms of income and expenditure, we now have an additional person, as I said before, about making sure that we check income and expenditure outside of the finance officer and outside of Tony. So we've got 3 people that work within that system. We do the check of it annually in terms of audit, and this is shared annually as a standing item on our finance governors. In terms of this private fund income, I think that related to something that was a one-off action that had happened, and we make sure that that doesn't happen again. I think that covers the issues that you've raised, unless you think I've missed something. But just to reiterate that our biggest thing is that we actually want to make sure that we're financially secure, that we're financially bomb-proof, if you like. The finances of the school going forward are much more secure. Our systems are much more robust. We feel that we've moved some significant way from where we were. And certainly in January 2012, where we were wasn't a great place. And a lot of the things that have been raised, we had raised ourselves. It wasn't that they came as a bolt out of the blue. We'd actually raised ourselves and were putting steps in place for.
Well, thank you very much for that very full and frank and detailed report. I'm sure the committee is very grateful to have received it. I think you've not ducked any of the issues there that have been pointed out. But I will now just throw it open to members if they wish to ask questions or make comments. Councillor Easton.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. It was quite comprehensive on the points that Mr. White put to you. I've got quite a few questions of where you are now from where you were previously. You got an end of year position which indicates is it still a deficit position, or is it a positive position at the end of the year? Before I carry on, were you in deficit, or are you in positive at the end of the financial year just gone by?
We've got a 3-year budget recovery plan, so we will still be in deficit this year, and because obviously we don't get the full 12/12ths, if you like, of any reductions that we make during this financial year. The end of this financial year, we're still projecting a deficit, as we are in year 2, although very, very, very much reduced, and then by year 3, we're starting to look in a favourable position.
Okay, to carry on then, following that, you went through the position of the high-value contract with a photocopier, and you seem to have resolved the situation that you've now found a way out of, found an exit from that contract. That was set up in 2009, so 5 years would have taken it out of place by 2014, but there was something in there which seemed to extend it, which you weren't aware of. You then talk about the catering contract, which you seem to have fully clarified. I then go on to, we mentioned the budget, then go on to this interest-free loan. I have a concern that you were put in a position of apparently not taking out this interest or allowing this interest-free loan in a proper manner, yet Monmouthshire County Council's Human Resources and Finance Department seem to have approved what you were doing, yet it seems to be a criticism now that it wasn't appropriate. I'd like a bit more information from Monmouthshire County Council's Finance and on that particular one. Purchasing goods and services direct from suppliers, you don't seem to have touched on that, or I might have missed it, I'm not sure. You then talk about the school vehicle.
I think the headmistress has just asked for clarification on your last point.
Sorry?
The headmistress just asked for clarification on that last point you raised. Could you put your microphone on, please, Councillor?
Oh, I thought it was on. I switched it off. I'm sorry. Really, they're the bones of some questions within there, which I'd like some clarification on. But additionally, I don't want to refer to a letter which has been sent to the Leader of Council, but I would ask the question of members of staff which were in post 3, 4, 5 years ago, which appear now not to be in post. You did suggest during your discussion to us that some were sick, some had left. Were there any exit, or what were there, and what were the exit packages for maybe 12 or 13 members of staff who have left for one reason or another? That's information being put before me as a councillor, which I know I don't think the letter I got is discussable this morning, but I'd like the details on exit packages on at least 13 people who left and why.
I'm really happy to answer that question to you. Out of the, I haven't had the courtesy of being given a copy of the letter by the signatories of it. I was, in fact, passed a copy of it by the Argus, which I think I'd like to, which I would just like to clarify. So you'll forgive me if I'm not referring to exactly the same letter as you. Of the 13 signatories, 6 of them had left before I'd even started. So just as we're clear there, I can't attest for why some of those had left. I haven't met a number of them who are signatories to the letter. Taking the ones that I do know, when in February of 2012, I did a presentation to staff talking to them about the budget deficit position and inviting any voluntary redundancies. I'd been in post then about 5 weeks. At that time, of the signatories, I'm trying to remember who are of those signatories, certainly four of those asked for voluntary redundancy at that time. So that was the position for those. They received the standard voluntary redundancy package that was laid out under the Burgundy Book, according to the Monmouthshire Local Authority Protection of Employment Policy. Nothing was enhanced, nothing was given to them that wouldn't have been given to them ordinarily. And we were in a position of our staff where we were significantly overstaffed. Out of the other signatories that I do know, 2 later left. No, sorry, I'm telling you a lie. 1 left. Trying to remember when one of them left. One of them left the following year, having been somebody I may have referred to, but I wouldn't like to identify, following an inspection, and 2 more applied for voluntary redundancy. So out of those, and again under exactly the same condition. So you are right to ask me that question, and I think perhaps you might prefer to know the facts of the financial situation if you would choose to do so. So the other 6 I've got absolutely no idea about the circumstances in which they left. The ones I know about, 4 weeks after I started, asked for voluntary redundancy, and the others then asked for voluntary redundancy later.
It seems there must be there's no cost being put through what you discussed. There must be a massive cost to allowing so many people to leave under a certain set of circumstances. I presume this was also approved by HR Department of Monmouthshire County Council. I asked the question, was it prudent to incur such costs when you were running into a position of deficit and continued deficit?
The costs under the Burgundy Book and under the regulations in Wales don't fall to the school. Currently, although that position obviously might change, and I think in terms of prudence, I think it's financially more prudent to have the right number of staff for the number of students to make sure that we're not overstaffed, because any redundancy cost is still going to be a fraction of a salary cost in any case. So the cost of keeping more staff than we need is obviously more than the cost of not keeping them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I was also interested in how the interest-free loan issue came around. It seems that Human Resources said fine and Audit said not fine. I was just wondering whether Mr. Wathen could fill us in a little bit more on that.
Thank you, Chair. From an audit perspective, a couple of points to it. First of all, about the tax liabilities. A head teacher is correct in saying that there were no tax liabilities ultimately. It would have fallen within the scope of a taxable benefit, but the HMRC does have a de minimis limit for loans of this nature, and it was below that de minimis limit, therefore no tax was due on this particular loan. In respect of, if you like, the procedure of it, there was a previous policy, and I must admit I'd have to remind myself, under which officers could be paid relocation expenses. And again, I'm not sure quite how that relates to teaching staff, but this arrangement was sort of a different arrangement to that. And what we would have expected was perhaps more sort of rigidly following the sort of existing relocation allowance package that does apply in certain cases. And our concern really was that this was an offer that was made available obviously to one single member of staff, whereas perhaps others may also have wanted to have it but wouldn't have had the opportunity to benefit from a similar deal. So that's why we flagged it up.
But did you think that the award of the interest-free loan was in some way financially incorrect or against MCC policy?
Yeah, as I said, there was a previous MCC policy, and this was not consistent with it, albeit the head teacher did tell me at the time that she had sought advice from HR and that they seemed comfortable with her proposals.
Okay, I'll leave that point there then, if that's all right with everyone. Does anybody else want to make some comments? Yes, I've got a few hands here, so let's start with Councillor Jordan.
Thanks. I appreciate that the task of a head teacher is a very difficult one, and head teachers are not trained to be accountants. In light of the fact that other schools within the county have bursars, do you think your school would be assisted by actually having a bursar?
Certainly in January to August 2012, we were not assisted at all by the presence of a bursar. We did, in August 2012, what we were looking to do is to appoint a bursar. Our financial position was such that we had to choose between teaching kids and raising standards or appointing a bursar. And one of the solutions that we came up with was working with the cluster and looking at making a cluster appointment, but also working with Nikki Wellington and her team, who've been kind enough to give us a great deal of support there. I agree, I think moving forward that the appointment of a cluster bursar will be a great support for us because it does detract from our time. I think that actually the uncovering of an awful lot of the issues that a bursar would deal with, at the same time I alluded to many of our premises related concerns that we had that were equally significant, and in some cases more significant because children's safety was at risk. We had a number of fabric of our building concerns, including a wall between the science department and a set of stairs that was a main thoroughfare for kids that wasn't safe, and things like that would also be part of a bursar's remit. That we we do have a premises manager who deals with all of that. I actually think that a bursar wouldn't necessarily have given some of the systems much more account than we are currently able to do because of some of those huge pressing issues, a lot of legal issues, things that we had to be legally compliant with in terms of premises, which is part of a bursar's job. Moving forward, yes, that is our intention, but I bring you back to, I suppose, that actually, despite all of this, we are a successful school. We are increasing student numbers, which makes us financially much more secure. We're now a positive force in the community. We now have 3/4 of our children leaving with 5 good GCSEs, including English and Maths. And I do stand by that decision. I think it's the right thing to do the right thing by young people, and I do stand by that.
So the answer is yes.
Right, we had a couple of other hands up. Councillor Hayward was one.
Thank you, Chair. I was actually going to make a similar point to Councillor Jordan. I mean, the bursar went in August 2012. You chose not to replace him. You said that you have actually spent money on training staff to take over some of the financial responsibilities and shared it around. But the school was in deficit in 2012. You obviously recognise that it had financial difficulties. You've made significant savings in staff in the meantime. You've had redundancies, which the cost didn't fall upon the school under the Burgundy Book. The cost fell upon the local authority. You've made savings in, or you're satisfied, you've looked at the catering contract, you've satisfied with the cost there, you've made savings in other costs there. And yet the school is now in a bigger deficit than it was in 2012 when the Bursa went. So you have to look and say, well, is the question of, is the decision about not replacing the Bursa a good decision or a bad decision? You also make the point up that you say that you put your focus on benefiting the school, but you've obviously put a lot of processes in the school. Those are jobs which the Bursa would have done as well. So in fact, you're detracting teaching time into Bursa's jobs, into process jobs, rather than the benefit of the children. And what I'm saying is that the financial aspects of the school, you have had an unsatisfactory audit, so you cannot say that the financial aspects of the school has improved in any way whatsoever. The audit shows that, in fact, the financial aspects have gone down. Isn't the choice of having a Bursa, whether it's a cluster Bursa or a Bursa in particular for the school, doesn't it prove that the decision not to appoint a Bursa, in fact, was a bad one, and you should now make every effort to appoint a Bursa at this time?
I think perhaps you're aware of, I'll answer that in three ways really. Firstly, has the financial systems of the school gone down? Given that most of the issues that were raised in the audit were historic, things that we inherited to put right and were attempting to put right, I would say that actually we've improved our financial systems and situations. That might call into question whether what audit looked at last time. They look at what they look at. In terms of, yes, we are again in a budget deficit. You'll be aware, I'm sure, that Welsh Government are receiving decreasing amounts of money. And you'll also be aware that UK-wide, that education is receiving decreasing amounts of money. And that decreasing amount of money when it hits schools in Wales has a significant impact. You'll also be aware, of course, that local authorities are receiving decreasing amounts of money. And in a way, for education, I think it's been described as a perfect storm in terms of projections of 20% decreases in funding. Local authorities' decreases in funding sometimes are looking at where services that currently have been delivered cost-free are now being charged for, quite rightly, in order for us to safeguard looking after our most vulnerable children, and some of the services around that will then have to be paid for by schools if they wish to buy them. So, in fact, looking at around a fifth less income across the next 3 years for schools is real. In Wales and in across the UK, I think David Cameron himself mentioned a 12% decrease in funding for education during the lifetime of his parliament. What that's meant for us, given that we're in we were in a falling school roll situation, was that the storm hit us earlier in terms of that deficit budget. We had a significant cut to our sixth form funding, which happened at the very last minute because the money that went to the local authority changed at the very last minute. We had a cut to to some of our grants, for example. So we actually were in a position where our funding was squeezed, where we were predicting that we'd be in a slightly better position because our school roll is increasing. We're in a worse position. The storms hit us earlier. We've taken steps to resolve it earlier. It's hitting all schools. I think you'll be talking about school budgets being very much tighter and head teachers having to make some really serious decisions about how they can actually afford to educate children in class sizes that are appropriate to their age, for example. So I sort of refute, I suppose, that the budget deficit was because of no Bursa, and completely agree that actually we need to make sure that, especially in today's straitened times, and especially in today's times where we know that education is a priority as an outcome for Monmouthshire, is a priority for people across Wales, and actually it's a moral priority for all of us to educate our children to the best, that we do need to have a bursar in place. I can't take out a teacher to pay for a bursar, but I can work within our cluster, and that's what we're doing, to be able to make a joint position where we're all protected, and actually protected going forward as 5 schools rather than singular schools, actually make some financial sense.
Can I just come back on that? You make the point, I recognise that the financial constraints of the future, but isn't it a fact, in fact, that the actual money you received, total income in 2014, was higher than the income you received in 2012? Now, remembering that teaching staff had a pay freeze, you said you got rid of all the SLAs for the staff. In actual fact, so you didn't have pressures of cost. The pressures of cost will be coming and money will cut in. But what was the actual figures of the money received in 2014, 2012? Because I think you actually received more in 2014 than 2012.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know I was going to be asked about the details of the 2012 budget. What I will say is that we're actually in key areas, we've had a significant cut to our post-16 funding in the region of around £200,000. So in order for us to deliver education to more young people, we've got less money. I know AWPU is being reduced. I know that some of the efforts we've made to attract money in has also given us more money. And of course, you'll be aware that costs increase. We've had increased funding through pupil deprivation grant, for example, that was certainly more than in 2012, because the number of free school meal students has risen by 2.1%, and they've doubled the amount of grant that they've given us for that. So some of our funding streams have increased, but we have to direct that on outcomes and achievements of free school meal students and most vulnerable students.
There are a number of reasons why our income increased. Firstly, our post-16 income in the school had been fixed under a 3-year arrangement, and that dropped. So irrespective of the numbers of students that we had, we received a certain amount of money. That starts to drop off, and also it takes a while for that to filter through because we're effectively funded a year behind. We'd also declared our SEGWEG and PDG income, so our full grant income we started putting in our budget as well to make that completely transparent. But probably the biggest impact you'll see in that is we at the school seconded a number of staff out to the Welsh Assembly Government in order to run the MEP programme, and also with the EAS as well, some support officers. Those 2 roles, which amounted to, I think in income terms, in excess of £120,000, would have appeared on our income line. We saved the staffing against that in our you'll see them in our staffing structure. So whilst it appears that our income has increased, because we've been completely transparent about those secondments, that's why it looks like our income line is higher than it was previously. But in terms of actual funding for pupils, you'll see that is in decline.
We've got a contribution from Nikki at the back, I believe.
Yeah, I've just looked very quickly at the funding, and the funding has decreased year on year. There has been a reduction.
Yes, Chair, I was quite clear. I wasn't talking about funding from the MCC. I was talking about the total income for the school, because most of the money is unhypothecated. It's obviously up to the bursar would juggle the money around and spend the money in the appropriate places. So it's the income of the school you have to look at, not the funding from MCC or the funding from any particular source. You've got to look at it holistically.
Yeah, I think I understand the difference. You got anything further you want to add?
Yeah, the real point is that the grant funding income that we have isn't up to being juggled around. That has to be spent on things that is clearly defined and audited by the Welsh Government and is based on what they say absolutely has to be spent on. So it's not a case that a bursar would juggle it around. It's an educational plan that's put forward that's based on student standards and achievement that we are then completely accountable for. So it is, the funding is in fact the thing that funds our staff. The grant funding is the thing that would fund some of our provision, but it's clearly defined what it has to be done, and that's a teaching and learning decision and not a funding decision.
Well, yes, Councillor Edwards, I would like to move on quite soon, but...
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I have every sympathy for any head teacher today. Not only do they have to be a first-class teacher, they have to be a first-class accountant at the same time. And holding my hand up, I was for about 5 or 6 years chairman of the Finance Committee at King Henry VIII School. And I know what a balancing act. It's a real work of art to balance the books on year in, year out. So to that extent, I have a great deal of sympathy with you. And certainly, to help balance the books, redundancy has to be looked at. You must go turn to teachers and say, are you available to, are you prepared to accept voluntary redundancy? And this is invariably the only way that at the end of the day you balance the books. And unfortunately, with the current economic climate, we're going to see more and more of this take place in order that the school can get through a very difficult period. The two questions really, the private funds, I know a little bit about private funds. I know at King Henry they had something like 50 or 60 different private funds. Are you in the same sort of situation? Do you have that sort of accumulated amount of funds? And do you have an outside auditor to verify the results at the end of each year? That's one question. And the other one is, how many, certainly at King Henry, when a previous head teacher came on board, he found that a lot of staff had been over-promoted, and I think you did mention this issue. How many staff did you find are over-promoted? A lot of £9,000 add up to a great deal sum of money.
I'll answer the second question first, and I'll get the technical questions from Tony on my left. In terms of how many staff were over-promoted, we had staff that should be teaching 22 hours a week were teaching around 20 just as main grade teachers, and in addition receiving huge TLRs, and we were still failing half of our students. We reduced the TLR structure by £100,000 just by looking at where we were over 3 years. We had members of staff who were receiving, I had somebody receiving £9,000 something for key skills. We hadn't entered key skills for the last 3 years. Had somebody receiving £5,000 TLR for running the Duke of Edinburgh, didn't run the Duke of Edinburgh. Had a member of staff receiving £9,000 for running a house system. We didn't have a house system at that time. And it was like that. So the TLR structure didn't reflect anything. And of course, had the TLR structure reflected teaching and learning responsibilities, results would have been much higher. So yes, that was the case. We had inherited that, and that was the first thing that we did. In terms of who audits a private fund, if you'll forgive me, I'll pass you to Tony.
Hello, thank you. We audit the private fund every year by people who are independent of our budget and financial systems. In the year in question... Are they qualified accountants? No, they're not. But they are. The audit is then submitted to be reviewed, and it's available to be reviewed.
I asked the question purely and simply because certainly at King Henry we went to a great deal of trouble to make sure that we had an independent, qualified accountant to audit the private funds.
No, that's fair, and we can do that. Yeah.
Okay, I think we had a... Sorry, Councillor Easton, I was going to go to Councillor Smith.
Sorry.
All I can suggest is make sure you use your microphones when you're making any points. I think that's what needed to be said. I think
Just-
it's...
just one-
can I just make a comment, please? I think it's very important to give this matter sufficient time. I'm very pleased that we've been dealing with it in the detail we have. We do have other guests here today who will be giving a presentation. So now, at this point, quite keen to move on. And I was thinking that we were starting to talk about the school financing regime, really, which wasn't the point that we originally came here from. I think Mr. Wethen wants to make a point.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to conclude, really, from the audit team's perspective, we've got to go out and we cover all services provided by the authority, and our remit is to assess the adequacy of the internal control environment at a school or at a system or at an establishment throughout the whole authority, to provide assurance to you as the Audit Committee, to provide assurance to the senior leadership team that there are adequate financial controls in place, so there's sound financial management across the authority for public expenditure, and to minimise fraud, theft and corruption. So that's what we look at when we do our reports, when we do our audits. The audit review is based on evidence that's either we obtain at the site or is provided to us when we go and do our audits. Plus, we review systems when we can do in terms of corporate procedures. It's very reassuring that the head has addressed the issues we've identified in the audit report and has continued to address those issues moving forward with the support from the school and from finance and schools finance. So that's very reassuring. The report still is in draft because we're still discussing some issues with the school and some information is to and fro between us and the school. But we will go back to the school and do a follow-up review in due course, and then come back to the Audit Committee and give our updated opinion, which hopefully will be an improvement on where we were for this time round.
Thank you very much. So, Councillor Eason, if you want to wrap up.
Just one brief comment that we never asked the question. You raised the point of CRB checks. There was a lack of them in the school. I would urge that you're the team management team, that the governing body actively source the CRB checks to make sure they're all up to date. Safeguard is very important, and I think that's something you brought up, we didn't bring up though.
Just to reply, that was the first thing I did. Obviously, that's my first responsibility, and we are completely compliant with not just up-to-date CRB or DBS checks, but also with all of the right-to-work legislation, and that's all held centrally, and anyone who is able to walk in and see it at the flick of a button at any time. I can reassure you about safeguarding.
Thank you very much.
Also, just to add, because I haven't said a lot, that reflects our external services providers, contractors, etc. as well. It is fully robust at this present time, and is also an item agenda on our meetings. Okay.
Right, well, I just one more question from Councillor Duffy.
Well, I was just wondering whether you'd like a contribution from the governors, a very brief one, one of the governors, a very brief one, or is it not appropriate?
It's not inappropriate if you want to make any comment. It's to the agenda item. Yes.
Well, I would like to make some comment. I'd like to make it clear that all the actions taken by the head teacher and her team were totally agreed by the governing body at every meeting that I attended. So what they have done was totally supported by the governors. The financing and developing the school and its educational plan and its place in the community, we saw as being the foremost priority. It was a prime objective because the school was, to say the least of it, in a parlous state before we had our new head teacher. The option of a bursar, we all asked that question, and it was a hard decision. I am sure the head teacher and the team would have preferred to have had somebody professional doing this job for them. it would have been an easy thing for them to do. But I really do commend the amount of effort they put into reaching the solution that they have with MonCC over the payment back of the deficit. And I applaud that completely. So really for us at that time, the education was the prime directive as far as the school was concerned. And it was particularly important at that time because of the issues MonCC had in terms of education as well. So we had to have the school performing at the highest level that it could. And with regard to the finance, I will raise this point. There are ongoing issues about the catchment for the school, which I think mitigates against their financial position, and I am supported by my other LEA governor in that view. That's all I want to say.
Thank you very much for that contribution. Can I just say thank you very much for all of that? You're very welcome to stay for the rest of the meeting. I think you probably will have other things to do. But yes, thank you very much. That was very useful to the committee, and there'll be the follow-up audit report later on, so it's not completely wrapped up. Okay, thank you. Okay, the next item on the agenda then is a presentation from Arlene Close about the Council's Treasury strategy. We asked for this presentation in a previous Audit Committee meeting, and when members were just asking for more information about this Treasury strategy. Now, I believe that Arlene Close have a presentation for us, so I think we'll see the presentation and then follow that up as appropriate.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Chris Taylor. Just to give you a bit of background, Arlene Close was established in the autumn of 2004 with the objective of providing local authorities with completely independent treasury management advice. Our philosophy is we earn our fees from local authority clients, not from any bank or building society with a commission sharing arrangement. And that puts us in a position then where we can give you completely independent advice. I started at Arlene Close in 2005 after a 30-year career in local government finance. And at the time there were 4 members of staff and we had 2 clients. We were the only Treasury advisory service that actively discouraged our clients from making investments in Icelandic banks because we felt there were fundamental flaws in putting money in institutions of that nature. And we were proved right. And after that point, we were appointed by Monmouthshire County Council to be the advisors. And we're very happy to provide that advice. So I'll be assisted today. It'll be a double act between myself and Laura. Some of these slides you might find a bit busy because of the distance you are from the screen. The TV that size, I can see it here. I'm struggling to see that one over there. So we'll do our best. So let's go down. So we put an agenda together on the basic question, what is treasury management? And then we'll look at the various things that we think are important in developing a treasury management strategy. You no doubt will have heard of an organisation called CIPFA, the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy. They've developed a treasury management code, and within that there's a definition which when we email these packs through to you, if you want them later, you can go into the precise detail of it. But there's a lot of words there that really mean it's all about borrowing or investing cash. So we'd look at it, why for it, not just Monmouthshire, all our clients, why do you actually find yourself in a position where you've got cash that you're borrowing and or investing? Well, we need to consider a few factors there. And the main thing is it's what's happening on your balance sheet. And Laura will go through that in a minute. So if we look at that, what's the interest rate environment? What about credit risk, i.e. the risk of, say, an Icelandic bank defaulting? And on the other side, what about your borrowing strategy? And that's what your Treasury Management Strategy Statement is doing each year, set in front of members. This is what the game plan is for the next 12 months, because we're incurring capital expenditure, we may well have a borrowing requirement, we may well have cash to invest. What's the plan of action for the year? And it sets up rules so that you have to abide by them. Because going back to when I started with Treasury Management in the early 1990s, there were no Treasury strategies. There was no SIP for code. And I think everything changed after BCCI, if anybody remembers that organisation. Anyway, let's move on. So, the balance sheet, over to Laura.
Hello. Okay, so as Chris mentioned, this slide is a bit busy with quite a few figures, but this is your draft balance sheet as at the 31st of March 2015. So kind of the most recent position we have of how the local authority, what position you were in. So the columns going across the top, we just have, these are some of the key sort of important data points that we pick out of your balance sheet and that will be used to inform your strategy. So CFR stands for Capital Financing Requirement. So what this essentially is your underlying need to borrow to fund your capital program and capital expenditure that you incur. We also need information on your usable reserves. So reserves are essentially money you put aside each year from revenue, and you put that money aside. Some of it you'll choose to put aside, some of it will be a statutory duty that rules about money you have to keep for various things. Your working capital is more looking at your cash flow on a day-to-day basis. Your position is actually you have a working capital deficit, a small one. So what that means is you're paying your bills faster than people are paying you what they owe. So you're always going to have a little bit of cash going out because of that reason. You've got your investments. Again, we'll talk about those later. But that'll form a part of your strategy of money you've got to invest and where you're going to put it. You'll also have borrowing that you're likely to need to do. And we also look at other debt liabilities, which are things that are, we've actually talked about, I think, leasing of vehicles earlier on in the meeting and possibly leasing of photocopiers as well. But they're essentially things that, although they're not a loan you've taken out, you still have a contractual obligation to make payments in the future. So it's very much considered similar to debt. So here we're looking at your projections over the next 5 years. If we look at 2015, so the first column first, so this is your position as at now. So you have a capital financing requirement, so a need to borrow of about 122 million. But your actual borrowings, the actual debt you have is 101 million. So there's actually a gap there between sort of your need to borrow and your actual borrowing. So you need to, what's plugging that gap? And what's plugging it is actually your reserves, as I mentioned, all that money that's kind of been put away from revenue. You're using that to fund a portion of your capital program rather than going out and borrowing from a bank. And we call this your internal borrowing. It's kind of borrowing from yourself. We actually think it's a very good idea for local authorities to do this, and we're pleased it's an approach you're taking. At the moment, you aren't getting good returns on your investment. Interest rates, as we'll cover later, are very low, whereas your debt, you're still paying, interest rates of perhaps 4%. So we think it's actually better if you can use your cash. If you use your cash, you're saving, having to spend 4% on that debt. And the only thing you're really losing is perhaps your investment returns, but they're going to be very low. And it also reduces risk that if you have less money invested in the first place, that's less money you can lose if a bank has a problem, you have another Iceland, something like that. it's very much as if you're an individual, you know, if you had £100,000 sitting in the bank and you wanted to buy a house that cost £300,000, you probably wouldn't get a mortgage out for that for the whole £300,000. You know, you'd use some of the money in your bank first and use that up to purchase something, rather than just borrowing the whole amount if you don't need to. So what we have is your usable reserves, but you're using some of those up to fund your capital programme, and the remaining money left, so that's that 12 million. We've got that investment/new borrowing line. So that was your investment position as at the 31st of March this year. You had 12 million invested. What we've then done is we've taken projections over the next 5 years, looking at, you know, your capital expenditure and what new things you're going to be incurring, to see how that position changes. And you can see that actually the figure turns negative. So what that infers is that you're going to have a borrowing requirement in future years. So you're going to be spending more money on capital programs, and you don't have cash to fund that, so you're going to need to go out and borrow. So your authority, you're largely looking at borrowing is your main kind of concern for the future.
Feel free to ask any questions at any point, because I know it's quite a could be quite a dry topic. If there's anything there that's unclear, feel free to ask a question.
Well, I think we do have a question from Councillor Easton.
Yeah, I'll just go through this graph now. So this is essentially taking this table. So this is a 5-year projection. This is projecting over 50 years and showing it in a graphical format. Obviously, we have to make quite a few assumptions going out this long period, but we still think this is a very helpful exercise. So what the blue line here is, this is your capital financing requirement. That's saying you'll need to borrow. But actually, as we've mentioned, that's not quite... Yes?
In due course, can you tell us what your assumptions are going to be, bearing in mind that Monmouthshire is unlikely to exist beyond 2020?
It's based on your estimates that were provided to us, which went out beyond the proposed reorganisation date.
So as I was saying, the blue line is your capital financing requirement, your need to borrow, although actually you don't need to borrow quite that much, because as I've mentioned, you'll be able to use your reserves to fund some of your capital programs. So that's the red line, that's what that represents. So the red line is really your actual need to borrow. What the grey area represents are your loans. So this is the only thing we can actually be certain of here. This is what we know. You've currently got borrowed, but you're obviously contractually obliged to pay off those loans back at certain times in the future, which is why that grey area is slowly going down in time. Don't worry too much about the light grey and the dark grey. Just consider it sort of overall grey area is debt. As you can see here, you've got the grey shaded area for most of the future is going to be below your red line. So again, that's showing you're going to need to do more borrowing because you don't currently have enough. And if you look at the size of that kind of white area between the red line and the grey area, that's the size of your borrowing. So you're perhaps looking at around £40 million, perhaps for the next 20 years or so, just to give you a rough idea.
Everybody happy with that? Yeah, okay. I mean, obviously, as Laura says, you know, we work on the basis, use your estimates, but then those estimates only go out so far. After 5 years, let's say, we just have to make assumptions about levels of interest, inflation, etc.
If we can go back to the first slide, we've got a very substantial pension liability.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Is that increasing or decreasing?
For the purposes of what we do, we ignore it.
Excellent.
Because it's nothing to do with treasury management. Anyway, should we talk about the interest rate? So we know you've got to borrow. So if you're going to borrow, what's the interest rate outlook? And if you can see that. Can you see?
Yeah, so we're obviously mostly concerned about what future interest rates are going to do, but sometimes it's always helpful to have a little bit of a look at history. So this is Bank of England base rate from 1694 to, well, the present day, really. It's just to illustrate, really, that we're in quite extraordinary times, really. Interest rates are very low, and actually the lowest they've ever been. And it's also an illustration of, how unpredictable perhaps markets can be. I think if you were looking at this graph, a few years ago, 2005, 2006, you would have thought, well, look, 300 years, rates have never really gone below 2%. But you can see now they're 0.5% and have been for some time. But I'll pass you over to Chris now, who'll talk about more what we think rates will do in the next few years.
But before I do, just bear in mind, I think I mentioned earlier that I started my treasury management career around about 1990. Started my local government career in 1975. So for me, the norm was, 10%, 9%. In fact, I can remember being advised, when I was in local government, being advised by a person in my sort of position now, who gave me the pearl of wisdom, when official interest rates drop into single figures, fill your boots. That was the, get out there and borrow. Because people just hadn't, they'd never, interest at 10%, yes. We'll never see 5% again. And as Laura says, things change, don't they? So what do we think is going to happen in the future? On that graph there, 2 lines. The grey line is bank rate. And the red line is the 10-year gilt yield. So that's the government cost of borrowing. We use that as a proxy for long-term borrowing, and the reason we use that as well is because the PWLB, which is the prime lender of money to local authorities, price their interest rates off gilts, and the standard rate is 80%, 1% above that gilt. But you can actually borrow at a certainty rate, which is 80% above the gilt. So that's a key thing. What we do when we are predicting what we think interest rates are going to do, and as you can probably might be able to make out on that graph, the solid lines start to go dotted towards the end, and the reason that they're dotted is because that's into the future. So they are our estimates of what we think may well be going to happen. So we look at economic factors and geopolitical factors to think about what would be the reason for the bank rate to increase. And the bank rate is set by the MPC. MPC's given a inflation target. Inflation should be running at 2%, but it can fall as low as 1% or as high as 3%. But if it goes outside those ranges, the Governor of the Bank of England has to write a letter to the Chancellor of the Exchequer explaining what's gone wrong. So bearing in mind the target is 2% for inflation, then they set the bank rate to try and influence that level of inflation. And the problem is at the moment that inflation's very low. So we would look and say, well, what would be the reason for the MPC to actually increase interest rates at the moment? Fine, there are improving economic factors, but our consensus view is that it will be next year, but we did think it would be earlier next year. We've now moved it to later next year. Similarly with the dotted line for the gilts, that's what do we think is happening to long-term borrowing? Well, gilts, government borrowing. Why would it be cheaper for a government to borrow some stages rather than others? A lot of institutional investors who will make their investment decisions, and at the moment we've got the Eurozone issue. So investors thinking, well, we'll buy UK gilts because we don't like what's happening in Europe. It's not necessarily because they like us, but they like us more than other places where they could put their money. Oh, and there are 4 quite busy charts there. But what they are all showing is, in all areas really, our projections of what these interest rates are going to be like over the medium term is pretty much in line with what the market says. Didn't used to be like that. We always said for a long time that for the official bank rate, it's going to be low for longer. So the market has actually moved into line with our projection. So if we've got interest rates, we've also, with an interest rate risk, we've also, from the investment side, there's credit risk to be considered. And really this Treasury strategy, which has got quite a bit in it about where you would be prepared to invest any money, has to take account of this thing here, the Welsh Assembly Government's investment guidance, which was written really after, well, it was rewritten after the Icelandic episode, because they wanted to make it absolutely clear that when local authorities have cash to invest, they should consider security, liquidity and yield in that order. So, is it in a safe place first? Is it easy to lay your hands on it? Second, and then yield. So you don't go chasing yield. You don't go investing your money for the object, oh, I can get 6% there. Because, yes, you might be able to get 6%, but it might be tied up for 20 years, and it might be with an organisation that might not have a particularly good credit record. So that's one thing you have to follow. Also within your strategy then you have to set out, in accordance with this guidance, there are 2 categories, specified and non-specified investments. And it's a bit of a, just because an investment is non-specified doesn't mean that you cannot make an investment in that category. It's really just saying for the specified ones, they've got to be in sterling, maximum duration of a year, high credit quality as assessed by you, the local authority, and not deemed capital expenditure by central government. And then the non-specified investments are everything else. So that will have been referred to in this strategy document. High credit quality, so you have to assess that, and that's probably where Mark and his team turn to us and say, what's your view on credit risk? Now then, if we go back to that issue about Icelandic banks at one stage had AAA ratings. But what we were concerned about were other factors, not just credit ratings. And what we've got there in that series of circles are the things that we take into account when putting together our advice to clients about counterparties for investment purposes. So we don't, yes, we do look at credit ratings. And one of the reasons we look at credit ratings anyway is because SIPFA says you must do, and you should also consider if there are, of the 3 main credit rating agencies, if one of them has a lower assessment, you should work on that one. But we look at other things, whether there's any government support, a thing called a CDS, which is credit default swap, which is essentially an insurance policy that you can take out effectively against a bank failing. So if those credit default swaps are high, that would suggest that the market feels there is risk in those counterparties. At the moment, those credit default swaps are low. We've got share price for banks, but not for building societies, their balance sheet strength, and subjective overlay. You know, yes, fine, that's what we think, but what else independent research says. So it's quite an involved process from our perspective. This strategy as well has been written now to cover the fact that it is illegal for a government to bail out a failing bank, as happened with Lloyds and RBS. And there's been a series of stages in dealing with this, what we call bail-in. So basically the people who make the investment in the organisation pay up if that organisation fails, not the taxpayer. And the UK brought in its own legislation, and then the BRRD, which is a European, and we're moving now into the deposit guarantee scheme. So it's been an evolution of bail-in. Now, why this is important from your perspective is because during that evolutionary process, the amount of money that a local authority would lose in the event of a potential default has actually increased. Its share has increased because other organisations have been moved out of the bail-in process. So say, for instance, individuals, you have your £85,000 per counterparty, that's outside. But within these stages, so that corporates have been moved out to a certain extent, and retail above 85,000, so that the real people who've got the real, taken the real risk with unsecured investments are the local authorities. Very colourful slide there. The green areas aren't you. The red, orange areas are potentially you if you're investing in an unsecured basis. What that's done, we've looked at all these organisations, the financial institutions' balance sheets, to take account of the fact that if there was a default, then who would pay up? And as you can see, it's different for everybody. So you know, bail-in isn't a straightforward arrangement. And how bail-in will tend to work is that the Bank of England will go into an organisation on a Friday afternoon after it's closed, and on Monday, when it starts trading again, if there's been a bail-in, then for somebody who gets caught in the bail-in, if they've got £1 million on Friday, it could be that on Monday their deposit is only 800,000. They've been bailed in for 200,000. And you don't want to be in that position. The next slide, credit ratings, as I said, it's not just about credit ratings, but it is important. Within a credit rating, there are aspects about the actual institution itself, but then the credit rating agencies look at whether there's any sort of parental support or you know, the sort of loss absorbency, as they call it, which is, you're on the credit team, you can talk about that. Do you know about loss absorbency?
Yeah, so again, that's to do with sort of this slide really, that some banks and some institutions, if they do get into trouble, they have kind of more of a cushion. All this green here is basically the cushion that gets hit before you do. So yeah, loss absorbency is to do with the credit rating agencies actually looking at that for banks, and it is often very different between different banks. So yeah, you obviously want to try and invest somewhere with more of a cushion. It's going to be a safer bet. So that's what that extra uptick they've got for some institutions for the rating is from.
And it used to be, I can remember when banks were always AAA rated, you know, they were the Swiss banks, AAA rated. And look, the triple B is, well, anything below triple B is junk grade, isn't it? So, triple B plus investment grade just about. So a lot of our banks now are just above investment grade, just about scrape in there. Like getting a grade 6 O level, as I did, in Latin. So, putting all that together, that slide there shows our advice to clients currently. as we say, where strategies permit, because you could have well set a strategy that perhaps you didn't want to have foreign counterparties there, etc. But that's what we say. Like I say, that's unsecured. So, borrowing strategy. So, as I say, from that table, so you will be doing some investment, but your investments will tend to be short term. What is heading down the line for you is a borrowing decision to make, a series of borrowing decisions. So, but why do you need to borrow? Well, that's because of your two things: your capital programme. You local authorities cannot really afford, as individuals can't, to say, I'll buy a house out of my annual salary. Most people have a mortgage so that they can spread the cost of buying that house over a period of years, and local authorities are in exactly the same position. So you, as a local authority, will tend to get a bit of support from the Welsh Government. So you can do some spending, what you call supported borrowing. It's supported through the revenue support grant. There's no supported borrowing in England, hasn't been for years. And then you get unsupported borrowing. That's where you decide, yes, we want to do this scheme. We know we won't get any support from the Welsh Government, but we believe it's prudent, sustainable and affordable, or may deliver significant benefits to the council. So no restrictions on local authority borrowing anymore. It's your decision. And like I say, you've been playing the game of internal borrowing for as long as you can, based on our advice, because we believed that was the best thing to be doing. But now you're going to have to externalise. Bit of legislation, which I can't see.
Just this is the legislation that outlines when a local authority is allowed to borrow. So essentially, a local authority can borrow for any purposes relevant to its functions under any enactment, or for the purposes of the prudent management of its financial affairs. So basically, you can borrow for doing things that a local authority does, such as running schools and fixing roads. Or you can borrow if you have to borrow in order to manage your finances. So that might be, for example, we've talked about working capital deficit. If you know you need to pay somebody today, but you're not getting your grant money in for a couple of weeks and you need to borrow money for that couple of weeks to tide you over, you're allowed to do that. The key thing here is what a local authority isn't allowed to do is borrow to invest. So what you can't do is speculate on the markets, and you can't just take out a loan and then think, oh, we're going to invest that in this bank or this fund because we think we'll make a good amount of interest from it. That's not why a local authority can borrow. So here's some sources of external borrowing. So again, you'll probably need to borrow in the future, so these will be things you'll be looking at. The Public Works Loans Board, that's the top one. This is borrowing essentially from the Treasury, from central government. It's kind of the most easily accessible and still widely used source of borrowing. There's also the European Investment Bank, a European bank that can lend to local authorities, or you can go out to any bank and there's nothing to stop you getting a loan, although most banks we find that the rate will be more expensive than the PWLB, so it wouldn't be something you'd be likely to use. Some local authorities have issued their own bonds and done things like that, although again this is something we don't usually advise. It usually tends to be very expensive and very resource intensive to do and doesn't really work out overall. Another way you can borrow is actually borrowing from other local authorities around the country that have investment balances. And that's something that Monmouthshire actually do currently at the moment, especially for short-term borrowing, is use other local authorities. Cost of carry, again, we've talked about this. This is if you do go and borrow, especially if you borrow long-term, it's quite expensive at the moment. It's still 4%. So you really don't want to borrow more than you need to, because if you find you're borrowing at 4% and then you're investing only at 0.5% or 1%, you're going to make a loss there. So if you can use internal resources, please do use that first. The rate you can borrow from the PWLB, so from central government, is usually 0.8% above the gilt rates, although for certain projects you can actually get a 0.6% above rate. So for certain things you can sometimes get a cheaper rate. You can borrow at fixed interest rates, so you can get a loan now for 20 years. It's going to, for example, stay at 4% that 20 years, or you can borrow at variable interest rates. A lot of people tend to think that fixed interest rate borrowing is less risky because you know the rate, once you've set it, it's fixed. Although really, fixed rate borrowing can have risks as well. As Chris mentioned, if you borrowed in the 80s and you paid 9% and you thought that was a good deal at the time, but actually you've taken a risk and now you're suffering that cost because you're paying this, really high interest rates that you didn't need to. So what we usually advise is that local authorities have a mixture of both fixed and variable rate borrowing to kind of hedge their risks. Obviously, the things you need to consider when borrowing, again, it's very much as if you or I were taking out a loan. You need to consider, can you afford to make repayments and how much is it going to cost you each year?
So, you've got a borrowing decision. The big question is, should I borrow now or should I wait until I physically need the cash? Because if I borrow now, I don't physically need it, so I'll invest it out. And I'll be paying whatever the rate is on the loan, and I'll be investing that cash out next to nothing for the intervening period. And we do this analysis, which we call cost of carry, looking forward into the future. And basically, we take account on top there, it's too far away for me to see, but look at the current ruling, PWLB rates, and then look at what the investment rates would be like if we were to defer, had that cash now, and we're either investing it for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months out into the future. And our analysis then say, well, okay, so we'd have that investment, but we'd be paying interest on the loan. And our analysis at the moment, if you get an area that's in green, that would suggest that, it's probably beneficial to borrow now. And anything else, well, the grey, browny coloured thing, it's sort of getting there close. And anything else, leave it, wait. You might as well wait. Now, if you go back to your liability benchmark, that wasn't suggesting that you need to borrow for 50 years on a maturity basis anyway. So, at the moment, we'd be saying hold fire. Now then, members. So, Treasury strategy, that's determining and improving the Treasury objectives through this Treasury management strategy, and in doing so, understanding all the risks and control of those risks. Consider a full range of options, which it does, and you approve that policy framework strategy and these funny things called prudential indicators, which are required under SIPFA's Prudential Code, which was brought in with the Local Government Act 2003 that changed the capital controls for local authority. So everything's interspersed, interjoined, because you've got this whole Treasury strategy. The reason you're borrowing is because you have a capital programme, and a capital programme that cannot be fully financed immediately from existing resources. Some of that capital expenditure you're going to pay for over a number of years, and in doing that you have to fund that transaction just the same as when you get a mortgage. But from time to time you'll also have this cash to invest. Treasury strategy covering all those. And because of this change with central government removing controls over local government capital spending, part of the deal was, yes, but you'll have to produce these things called prudential indicators. They tend to be at the back of the strategy, and I would imagine there is only one indicator that you must not breach, because it's mentioned in the 2003 Act. It's an affordable borrowing limit, the overall limit. And what general authorities do in general, they set that limit at a level that they won't breach it. They're not in danger of breaching it. I think the prudential indicators are over-engineered now and probably past their sell-by date. May well be reviewed in the future. So, members here, Audit Committee, looking at governance, receiving reports and reviewing internal audit reports, and seeing people like us and asking questions about what is in this Treasury strategy document and does it make sense and is it the best thing for Monmouthshire. So if I was a member, I might be asking, well, hang on, I was here last year, we approved it, what's changed since last year? And then this one, in yours, the big change was about, for your investment counterparties, having not just unsecured investments, but also having a category for secured investments, because secured investments are exempt from bail-in, and you don't want to be bailed in, so secured. And there are other areas, what has been evaluated to ensure capital preservation. So we talked there about the advice that we give and the factors we take into consideration, not just credit ratings, a whole range of things. Is our investments diversified? Yes, they are. You've got quite a wide range of options available within the Treasury strategy. And then, of course, you could have, I read in the Daily Mail, or it was on the BBC News that what will be the impact if Greece exits the euro this evening? Does that impact on our Treasury strategy? Will it impact on interest rates? So there's all those sorts of things that come into the scrutiny. So, any questions?
Yes, and that's from the chair as well, whether there are any questions or observations. Members are probably aware that the meeting is can carry on till 1 o'clock, then the room has to be vacated. So I'm going to attempt to just try and push on with the agenda. If we're starting to have any difficulties getting all the business done, then we might think about the order that we're going to take things in. But questions and observations on the Treasury strategy, please. Yes, Councillor.
Chair, it's a very comprehensive report you just had. A great deal of difficulty in reading what's on the screens. Can I say, well, I understand we are going to receive a copy of all that information, and it would be useful, I think, in terms of once we've managed to absorb all that we invite them back at a later date so we could, ask probably much more pertinent questions.
I think that's very reasonable, and I think that for the presentation to be made available to members would be a very good thing. You were all having difficulty seeing the screens. I wasn't seeing anything at all up here, just trying to look over the shoulder, so I will welcome that. It's really a question of, once we've seen that report and had a chance to think about it, whether we then want to invite Arlene Close back. But also, of course, this presentation informs our scrutiny, if you like, of the Treasury management, which is a separate paper, which I think was given to the committee some months ago, and it's a regular one for us, so that will keep on coming round. Yes, Councillor Dovey.
On one of those screens, you mentioned bonds came up as one of the bullet points. When we were looking for ways of dealing with our finances for the coming 12 months, maybe the next 3 years. I know in Chepstow, a number of the public said that they would be happy to invest in the county in some form of bond, providing the interest was marginally better than they were getting elsewhere, which shouldn't be very difficult at the moment, put it. And we turned it down as a council. It didn't happen. I was a little surprised at that, because I thought it was a good idea. No, I hold myself up as being any sort of financial guru in any way, shape or form, but why would the council have seen that as being a thing that they chose not to do?
So what you're referring to there, I think, is the old, what we'd call the local bonds that used to exist back in the 80s. Basically, it's administration. Administration. Your Treasury team here can pick up the phone, speak to the PWLB, arrange a loan in 5 minutes, you know, and the money's there in 2 days. Bang, it's done. I used to deal with local bonds. You had £100 from Mrs. So-and-so and £5,000 from the such a thing club, and you had to send out a certificate and do the tax return. And I think the real thing that killed it was when R85, I think it was called, came in, where you could self-certify yourself to not have tax deducted on your investments. So it'd be spending an inordinate amount of time bringing in a small amount of money to the council, and like I say, I could pick up the phone and say, can I have £20 million for 10 years on a maturity basis, whatever, and 2 days later it's there. So it's really, the bonds that were being referred to in that presentation were not the local bonds, they were bond issues by local authorities. So say Transport for London has been a recent issuer of bonds, and I think they were able to borrow at pretty close or possibly below the ruling gilt. But it was, for an authority the size of Monmouthshire and its borrowing requirement, you wouldn't go down that route because the market is only interested in numbers, you know, 250 million and above. So you haven't got a borrowing requirement of that size. Okay, you might want to join a club with somebody else. Who would else be in that club? And do they want exactly the same thing that you want? Difficult to achieve. Could end up in a nasty divorce. So appropriate for some people, but not for everybody.
Right, any other comments and observations? Well, there's a contribution from here.
Thank you, Chair. Just one observation and one question, if I could. The first observation is that Internal Audit have recently completed an audit review of Treasury management in the Council, and I'm delighted to say that we gave a very good audit opinion as a result of that review. In fact, I think it was the only very good opinion that we gave in the last financial year, so members can hopefully take assurance that from our review of Treasury management operations in the Council. One quick question, if I may. There was a comment in the presentation about local authorities aren't allowed to borrow to invest, but then later on under cost of carry, there seemed to be a suggestion that you could borrow early and then possibly invest for a short period of time before you need that money. So I just wondered if we could have a bit of further clarification on that.
Yes. Can we get the presentation back on the screen? So. Just want to find a slide that will help explain that. Right. You know, in the balance sheet analysis, and we said that we were interested in this thing called the CFR, the Capital Financing Requirement. So that is Monmouthshire's cumulative capital expenditure that needs to be financed, i.e. resourced. And what we do to cover that before it is resourced, we have to fund it. So we borrow somebody else's money. Now, if we've got to pay that money back, we've got to have the means of paying it back. And you make a charge to revenue to ensure that you can pay that back. So that orange, turquoisey coloured line is your CFR. And this issue about borrowing to invest is if your physical borrowing is above that CFR line, then you'd be saying, actually, I'm borrowing to invest because I don't need it. But your borrowing's well below the CFR, and we don't even want it to get up as high as the CFR. We want you to remain internally borrowed as much as you can, and hence your borrowing requirement will be that white area under the grey mountain and the red line.
You could actually, if you did borrow more than the green line, as Chris was saying, or you borrowed sort of before you need to and you're investing that difference, if you can demonstrate that that is a prudent decision and you have a very good reason for doing that, you would be allowed to do it. So, for example, if you felt that interest rates were going to go up quite a lot in the future, you could argue we've borrowed now because rates are low now, so we think we're going to save overall, even though we're borrowing a bit before we need to. We're taking advantage of these low rates, so we have a good reason for doing that. If you could do that and you could fully demonstrate that what you've done was part of a prudent management of the council's finances, then you could effectively borrow to invest in that instance. But it would be an exception.
Yeah, we can just caveat that as well. It's within SIPFA's Prudential and Treasury codes, but there is a restriction on that. You can only do it against your projected increase in the CFR over the next 2 to 3 years. So you wouldn't go and say, well, I think I'm going to need £10 million in 20 years' time, so I'll borrow it now. It's no.
Right. Are we back to the regular screen then, Chair? Yeah. Okay, good. I've got a question from Councillor Edwards.
Simple question. Borrowing from PWBP is how much compared to the EIB?
Well, they're pretty similar. The only issue you've got with the European Investment Bank is that it's only available for infrastructure projects, and it can be cheaper at certain times, but it's not at the moment.
Okay, well, if there's nothing else for Arlene Close at this point, I would like to thank you very much for your detailed presentation, and I'm sure we'll all enjoy looking at the actual slides when they're passed on to us. But it is a proper matter for the committee to consider, and of course a copy of the presentation will go to other members who I know have an interest in this, but are clearly not able to be here today. Because I think the issue was originally raised by Councillor Petruni, who hasn't been here today. Okay. Just to make it clear to everyone what the plan is from now on as far as this meeting is concerned, I do want to finish by 1 o'clock because I think it's not reasonable to carry on beyond that time. I'm going to postpone the Audit Committee Self-Assessment Workshop report until the next meeting, which will be in July. Looking ahead on the work plan, that seems to be a reasonable thing to do. I don't think we could have a proper discussion about it now, and I'd like to see more members present when we do. So I'm going to go on to agenda item. I did thank you very much for the presentation, didn't I? and yeah, and say you're welcome to stay or whatever. So I'm going to go on to the Wales Audit Office report on the financial resilience of councils in Wales. I will invite Mr. Wyndham to say a few words about the paper, if he will. But I do understand that there has already been a Welsh Audit Office report on the resilience of MCC, and that the report was that our resilience was adequate, and then we were told that no one gets better than adequate, so that's quite a good one. So if I can now just turn that over to Mr. Wyndham.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Yes, you're quite right. There was, as members will recall, probably about 2-3 months ago, an MCC specific report on the financial resilience. And what we have here today is the composite report, drawing on all the conclusions at each piece of that work, undertaken at each local authority in Wales. It's quite a large report. It covers some 56 pages, and in view of the timescales and your comments, Chair, I don't intend to go through this in any great detail, particularly in view of the fact that the MCC specific report has already been to this committee and also to Cabinet. It is very much a high-level report, as it pulls together all of the findings, as I say, across each of the councils. And I think the key thing you need to perhaps take on board is just to be aware of the existence of this report, and officers then to be aware of the content of the report in greater detail and maybe self-evaluate themselves against a number of the recommendations included in this report. And those recommendations are at page 32 and 33 in the pack. Now, I don't intend to go through those in any detail, but obviously happy to take any questions on those recommendations or on the report itself, for that matter. But the other thing I will say, this work is part of an ongoing process which the Wales Audit Office is undertaking, and quite rightly so, really, isn't it, in view of the change in position, you know, not just in terms of the ongoing financial pressures all public bodies are facing in Wales, but also in the context, I guess, of potential reorganisational change, which is also occurring. But the intention is that additional work will be done on financial resilience here at Monmouthshire and also across every other local authority site later this summer, and an additional report, both an MCC specific report and a composite report, would come to this committee later this year. As I say, I don't think there's a great deal else I want to say about this report, but happy to take any questions there might be.
Councillor Easton.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's just in relation to your Appendix 3 vis-a-vis Appendix 2, where Appendix 2 illustrates ways of working in English county authorities as opposed to the Welsh authorities, which are driven really by, as you state, directions from national government. How do you correlate the two in that aspect?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure if I understand your point. I'm sorry, Councillor.
Well, it would appear to me that the English authorities are a bit more independent of decisions as opposed to what I think you may be saying about the Welsh authorities being more centrally controlled.
No, I'm not really sure that is the case, really.
Right, okay.
Why some case studies are included here from England is that the austerity measures hit English authorities earlier than Wales. So there's some lessons potentially to be learnt from the English authorities. So the inclusion of some case studies from England, you know, they're not there as chapter and verse, this is the way to do things, but they're there to sort of stimulate debate and suggestions for potential courses of action Welsh authorities might seek to take. Yes.
Yes, Cap.
We all know that
I think, as you know, the longer you go into the future, the greater the uncertainty there's going to be anyway, both in terms of funding and funding pressures and reorganisation, for that matter. There's, you know, the further you go ahead, the more uncertainty there is. I think the medium-term financial planning process, as it stands at the moment, seems appropriate and reasonable to bear in and take in view of that, you know, future uncertainty. I have not seen the question hierarchy in terms of the areas we'll be asked to look at in terms of the future, the next stage of this audit work we'll be undertaking later this summer. But it could very well consider some of those aspects, or ask us to consider some of those aspects. But as things stand, it's not something we have any concerns with at the moment.
I guess part of the point I'm making is that so many things are ring-fenced. Education ring-fenced, social services ring-fenced, which is putting a bigger strain on other items. Now, when they're looking at possible cuts of, say, 40 billion over the next 7 years in local authorities across Britain, probably 2 or 3 billion in UK, with that ring fencing in place, can things like local transport, for instance, be sustainable in the long term? Should we be looking at that now and saying, how should we tackle that? What's our policy for that over the next 7 years in light of the cuts that are going to come? Because we know that more cuts are going to come, and we know the size of those cuts.
I think we're going into territory now that's very much like sort of a policy sort of decision really from the council, and it'd be inappropriate for me to really to comment on that. That, you know, that's a matter for.
But no, if you look at authorities across Wales in general, not just Monmouthshire County Council.
I'm happy for the councillor's comments to go on record as a councillor raising a concern, but I agree with you that this is not a budget-setting forum, so I think that point's well made there. Do we have any other comments or observations on this report? I would just like to commend it to officers in MCC to take into account in developing future strategy. You happy with that? Fine. Okay, good. I'll move on then. As I said, I'm going to postpone the self-assessment workshop report, because I think we need to do some work on that and make some suggestions about the way forward. So I'm going to move on then to internal audit. I think Mr. Wathen wants to take item 14 first, the outturn report. Yes, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, thanks, members. These are two key documents which I bring to your attention on an annual basis. The first being the annual audit report, the outturn report for 14-15, which is looking back on what work we've done. And then the second report will be on the plan looking forward to 15-16, what work we propose to do. So taking the first report, the annual outturn report, as a brief overview, this is split into two sections, primarily to give you the assurance on the opinion work that we undertake during the year, which I've already outlined previously this morning, about giving you assurance on the adequacy of the internal control environment to ensure there's sound financial management across all services and systems provided by the authority, and also to minimise any fraud and corruption. And then the second part is to talk about the performance of the internal audit team. The overarching compliance is that we need, as an audit team, need to make sure we're compliant with our public sector internal audit standards. So all our work is considered and undertaken with respect to those standards. In terms of an overall opinion, just wanted to make members aware that the opinion was reasonable for 14-15, and that's outlined in paragraph 2.2 of your papers in my report. Based on the work that we've undertaken, where we've identified 28 opinion-related audits during the year. We've done a lot more work than that and done it in accordance with our audit plan. But that's outlined on paragraph 2.4 in the table, which shows a comparison of previous years and is split into the various opinions we issued. Dave's mentioned already that one of the reviews we undertook was very good, which is reassuring. There were 9 good reviews, 12 reasonable reviews, and this year we've picked up 6 unsatisfactory reviews, which I'll come on to in a moment, but reassuringly no unsound reviews. So overall, that feeds into my opinion in giving you the assurance on the adequacy of the internal control environment, which we feel is reasonable, and there's an appropriate definition for that. In terms of the unsatisfactory audits, I have outlined them on paragraph 4.3. and that they're shown in the appendix. And I've got some information here in terms of why we felt they were unsatisfactory. But what I intend doing is just to update my 6 monthly report to Audit Committee in terms of progress of unsatisfactory audit opinions, and I'll be giving members a lot more detail about those particular unsatisfactory reviews at that time. But just to give you some information, I mean, Richard's come already about the passenger transport unit, primarily on the back of exemptions that were pushed through on the procurement process. That's why he's attended Audit Committee. We've done a review of the whole process that he's responsible for, and contract procurement was part of that, part of those concerns. But we did have other issues, such as budget monitoring, documentation not being available to us, and information not being up to date. So I'll explore that in a bit more detail in the report coming to Audit Committee at a later stage. The procurement side, again, non-compliance with Welsh Government expectations, lack of resource in the team to do everything that is required as a procurement team, and again, more information can be provided. Llandogo School was lack of sufficient information, but reassuringly, that has been reviewed, it's been followed up by the audit team within the year, and that's moved up from an unsatisfactory opinion to a reasonable opinion, so there are signs of improvement within the financial management and arrangements of that particular school. Chepstow School, that's been aired this morning, and the Audit Committee members have had an opportunity to challenge the management of the school, and they've given us assurance that they're moving forward and have addressed most of the issues which we raised at the audit. Another primary school then was rated as unsatisfactory. Again, just breakdown in controls from a financial perspective, more details to be provided. Monmouthshire Enterprises, there was a fund which has been set up which needs to be addressed and used appropriately. There were some issues over the lease arrangements of the buildings that were being used, and some insurance cover, and there were information about budgets which we were concerned about, just in terms of monitoring on a day-to-day basis. So those are why we felt they were unsatisfactory in terms of compliance with financial regulations, contract procedure rules. So that's the first part, and I'll come on to the appendix where we outline all the opinions in a moment, Chairman. In terms of the performance of the team, sorry, Chairman. It's not as good as we would have hoped in terms of the year. The completion of the plan was 65% against the target of 80%, which is a key performance indicator for us. But as members will be well aware, we've had significant resource issues within the team. Getting reports out on a regular basis has also been not as good as we expected. Again, down to resources within the team. We thought we'd addressed it a year last January when we took on board an audit principal. Unfortunately, that person left in January of this year, just as he was getting up to speed with helping us put through our review and our quality assurance programme. So it's left us in limbo at the moment, and we've kind of got vacancies within the team which we were hoping to address within the next couple of months. If I could just refer members to Appendix C. That shows the individual opinions we've issued, outlining them per opinion. So the very goods, the goods are grouped together, the reasonables are grouped together, and then the 6 unsatisfactories. We've also had a number of unqualified reviews where we do primarily in grant claim checks on behalf of the funding organisation. Unqualified is good. It means that they comply with the terms and conditions of that particular grant funding organisation. I just take members to Appendix D. That gives a snapshot of all of our performance indicators for the team for 14-15, comparison against the target, and a comparison on a year-by-year basis for the 3 former years as well. I'm happy to take questions on the report, Chairman.
Thanks very much for that. Not seeing any hands up at the moment. Good. So thank you very much for that report. It's good to know that we're going to have a follow-up report on the unsatisfactory opinions that we haven't been able to talk about in detail so far. So the next agenda item is just to return to the previous paper, the audit section operational plan, which I think is item number 13.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Again, this is a key document for us to get approval from the Audit Committee about work we intend undertaking for 15-16. It's a report that I brought to you previously. The data has changed, obviously, because we're going to cover different areas within the programme. It's probably easier for me just to refer members straight to Appendix 2, which gives a summary of the audit days we've got in the plan. That is 800 days for 15-16, slightly reduced because we know we've got a current vacancy in Q1 from the information that was provided to you in the previous Audit Committee. And then that's split over all the directorates. And then on an individual basis, on Appendix 3, that shows the individual jobs which we intend undertaking, 15-16. And to confirm a previous question that was raised at Audit Committee is to identify within this programme what work was planned for 14-15, wasn't undertaken, but carried forward into 15-16. And those are indicated by an asterisk in that plan. You can see which service area the job is going to be involved with, which areas we're going to cover, whether we think it's a high, medium or risked review, and the number of days we intend spending on a particular individual job. Hopefully members will agree that that gives us sufficient coverage across the whole of the authority and is based on the resources we've got available. We do start off with a much longer list of items we would like to audit, and then we whittle that down on a priority basis and come down to the resources that we do have available. I'm conscious of time, Chairman, so I'm happy to take any questions.
Is everything that you weren't able to do in 14-15 on the list for 15-16?
It is on the list, Chairman, but we've had to revise some of that because we know we've got a known resource issue, and some of that you'll notice that where there's an asterisk, there are 2 jobs which haven't got any days next to them, so they'll be put on the back burner. If we've got any spare resource in 15-16, then they will be done. If not, they'll be carried forward to 16-17.
Thanks for that. Any questions or observations from the members? These are, of course, important matters, so I'm not trying to gloss over it too quickly, but no, I will say we'll move on then. Thank you very much for that. That's an important item of continuing for the committee. So I think we formally note that we've received those reports. Next item on the agenda then is going to be the forward planner. I need to discuss with the clerk and secretary. The forward planner seems to have got a lot less in it than we saw last time. So actually, I think that's just a mistake. I think we do have a forward plan through to the end of the year, and I will show you that in a moment. And I believe that we need to just say what the date and time of the next meeting is, which is not as written in the papers. It's going to be when?
The next meeting is Thursday, 16th of July.
Oh, you have, right.
Yes, Thursday, 16th of July at 2 p.m. and then the 23rd of September meeting will follow that one.
Right, okay. In which case, I'll say thank you very much for attending. It's been a long meeting. It's also been it's also been a meeting with a great deal of important information, interesting information. We've had a number of presentations, not usual papers being delivered to the committee, but presentation from Chepstow School, presentation from Arlene Close, and I think a very valuable meeting. But I will want to return to the self-assessment paper because I think that something may well come out of that. So thank you very much, everyone, and I'll see you at the next time.